You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Reshie Joseph. Reshie, welcome.
Hi, Guy. Thank you for having me on the show. Real pleasure to be here.
I appreciate that. So Reshie is a clinical psychologist who specializes in the treatment of PTSD, complex psychological trauma, addictions, and other disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified. Reshie began his professional career as a doctor, having obtained his medical degree from the University of Sheffield in the UK. Since leaving medical practice, he's currently fully retained as a clinical psychologist with an MSc from King's College London in psychology and the Neuroscience of Mental Health. And he now practices exclusively as a psychological professional. His work experience includes working within the criminal justice system in Singapore as part of the prison psychiatric team, treating individuals with a wide range of serious psychiatric illnesses and severe personality and behavioral disorders. More recently, he has spent time working in the private sector with the Cabin Addiction Services Group as a substance abuse and trauma therapist at Asia's largest inpatient rehabilitation center in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Reshie, welcome to the podcast.
Wow, I've read that before, but to hear it actually read back to me, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it?
It's a pleasure to have you on here. I'm excited to get into this. Before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Okay, so I was born in Singapore to a Sri Lankan father and a Singaporean Chinese mother. And I spent my early education in Singapore. And then I went to England to boarding school, finished my education in England, and then went on to university to medical school in England. And graduated medical school, started practicing as a doctor, and that's really when the wheels started to come off. And here's one of the difficulties we have with the education system, I think, which is that if a child is getting a 4-point GPA in your system, or all A's in our system, that child is considered perfectly normal. They don't look any closer at that child. Mm-hmm. They don't see what's going on with that child. I realize now that even a cursory glance at me would have revealed that there were severe abnormalities in my behavior that any half-baked counselor would have picked up on.
Such as what?
Such as isolating, odd self-soothing behaviors like tics, bordering on Tourette's, various other not massive things, but enough to tell you this boy is suffering. There's something. There's something going on with this boy. He might be a straight A student, but he's there's something going on with him. Wasn't picked up. So I got all the way through medical school and couldn't hold it together any longer. And when the wheels came off, it came off in a very spectacular fashion. And to cut a long story short, it went from a promising career as a surgeon or a physician to becoming a homeless heroin and crack cocaine addict on the streets of London.
Oh my gosh.
And that was in the early 2000s, between 2003, 2004, and 2010. Since 2011, I have been in the recovery process. so far. Haven't taken any street drugs, drunk any alcohol, etc., etc. Long may it continue. And whilst I was in that process, I had, of course, had a chance to go back to medicine. But the process of going back to medicine is a very stringent one. It's 5 years of continuous testing, urine tests, psychometric tests, etc., etc. I'd completed all of that. But by that point, I had gained a love for working with people. I had discovered trauma, and I had discovered that trauma really was at the root of why I was uncomfortable in crowds, why I found relationships difficult, why I had intrusive recollecting, nightmares, flashbacks, why I had fantastically negative core beliefs about myself, and why I seem to have what we now call somatoform disorders, physical disorders of all kinds that had no explanation in medical science. I didn't know at the time, but what I was looking at was a slam dunk for the diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD, as adumbrated by the great Judith Herman and her colleague Bessel van der Kolk.
If I may, Reshie, you described as a younger individual, getting stellar grades. No one would give a second look, and yet something was going on, albeit kind of in the background to a certain extent. What was going on? Is that what you're talking about? This trauma response, in a sense?
So what was going on was a great deal of violence. There was a great deal of violence, which in and of itself can actually be mitigated, believe it or not. You can have a lot of violence in a child's life as long as the child has a place to go that's safe, right? So we know this from our study of attachment behaviors. I don't know if you know what attachment is. You're a trauma podcast, so I'm assuming you know what it is. The difficulty with my childhood was there was a great deal of violence in it, but I had no parental caregiver, adult caregiver to whom I could form a secure attachment. I went through the whole of my school life, and the only secure attachment to an adult caregiver I can remember was to an elderly lady at boarding school. I still remember her name. She was 72 at the time, and I was 15 years old. And her name was Rosemary Sutcliffe. And for some reason, she saw this small, brown boy from the East coming over to England, and the white boys picking on him. And she decided to take me under her wing, and she was kind, and she was nurturing, and she was all the things you would imagine a mother would be. And she didn't live very long after that. So I had a taste of what secure attachment was. But apart from that, I went through the whole of my childhood without a single secure attachment to an adult figure, and at the same time faced a great deal of violence, some of it racial. I mean, I can go through the whole list of it, but I don't think we'd have time for that. But yeah, there's a great deal of violence.
So you went through medical school, which is, crazy to think about given what you just said.
Yeah.
The wheels came off in a spectacular fashion.
Yeah.
What Can you talk, Reshie, about the process of kind of, quote unquote, discovering trauma, being aware of trauma, and realizing that you had an interest in pursuing that?
Yes. So I would imagine that you would be wondering, how does a boy who grows up, being beaten almost every day till he's 11, and then fairly regularly after that till he's about 15, and it continues till he's about 18. How does that boy go on to become a doctor? And I'd learned this fabulous trick, and this fabulous trick is called dissociation, which is the ability to split one's mind from the emotional component, right? So every memory we have has a cognitive component and an emotional component. This is vastly oversimplifying it, but if I asked you, for example, what you had for dinner last night, you would tell me I had roast and vegetables or whatever. So that would be the cognitive component, but you would also have an emotional component. Mm-hmm. You would remember how you felt. You were with friends, you were with your partner, it was a pleasant experience. That's the emotional component. Now, when the emotional component becomes so horrific, what the brain does is it does this very nice trick of splitting the two and suppressing the emotional component. And that essentially is the process of dissociation as we understand it from a neurological perspective. And so I had spent all of my childhood dissociating and repressing feelings of terror, feelings of fear, rage, all of the things that you would expect a child who was hit every day till age 11. You would imagine all of that was suppressed and done very well. But an incident whilst I was a doctor, fortunately or unfortunately, triggered a situation where the emotional component that had been suppressed for so long, that Pandora's box was opened. And suddenly all of those emotions came flooding back. And it came from the first authentic human attachment that I made, which was to a boy who was dying of cancer. And I talk about this in my book. And, his death was extraordinarily painful to me because it was the first true attachment I believe I had in life. And when he passed on, and that attachment was severed, that's when the wheels came off. That's when because now that the box had been open and the emotions were all flooding out, I had no means with which to, I had no skills with which to self-soothe or self-regulate. And so I had to rely on increasing amounts of alcohol and very quickly, very large amounts of very powerful painkillers, which very quickly led to the addiction that I adumbrated earlier. Does that answer your question?
It does, but I want to follow up here. So, at what point did you realize you wanted to pursue this topic of trauma, this subject of trauma?
Well, when I was 18 months into my recovery, I had an episode where I had gone into a rage, and it was not any rage. It was the kind of rage where men kill each other, that kind of rage. And I remember coming out of the rage and looking at the people around me and just seeing the terror in their eyes, right, at what had just happened. And I didn't know what had caused that, but I did know what hadn't caused it. And what hadn't caused it was drugs and alcohol, because I hadn't had any for 18 months.
Wow.
So it was not the drugs and alcohol that was responsible for that. Something else was responsible for that. And that was the first time I asked myself the question, well, if it's not the drugs and the alcohol that's responsible for for these constellation of bizarre symptoms that I continue to have, then what is?
Mm-hmm.
And the quest to answer that question led me to trauma. I was also very fortunate when I was at the cabin to work under two of the finest trauma therapists that I think even till this day I've ever met. And they were very generous with their time and took the attitude that, well, if you want to learn, we'll teach you.
Mm-hmm.
And so they taught me the basics, pointed me in the right direction, sent me off for the various trainings that you have to do, things like EMDR and CPT and exposure therapy and all the various other kinds of somatic therapies that one has to have to be a trauma therapist. But it was really the influence of these two men, and to see how they negotiated trauma, and beginning to understand that so much of what is puzzling about humans, when people explode, when people curl up into a ball in fear, or when they hide in a cupboard, or when they upturn the table at Christmas, that a lot of it can be traced to an unresolved trauma. Now, there is a danger, of course, of labeling everything as trauma, and I think this is where part of the maturation process is to begin to disagree with people, with individuals that one had slavishly admired for a while. For a very long time, I was a great fan of Gabor Mate, and I was a great fan of Bessel van der Kolk and Judith Herman and Christine Courtois, John Brier, all the big names. I won't Dan Siegel. I won't waste time going through the names, but it was the ability to begin examining that with a critical eye and saying, well, if what they're saying is true, then practically everything is a trauma, which in a sense it is, because the word trauma itself simply means wound. But a wound can be a small cut on the leg, or it can be an axe in your head. Wounds come in.
Isn't it fair to say that, all those people you mentioned, there is a distinction to be made, right? I mean, I don't think it's that they're saying every wound is trauma, but the wounds that are so severe, such that one's entire nervous system becomes completely dysregulated. And
Yeah.
it's presented on a spectrum as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But let
Yeah.
me ask you something, Reshie. Up to that point, when that attachment severance happened, prior to that, had you understood trauma? Had you ever thought to yourself, "My God, I had this experience growing up, beaten every day"?
Never heard the word, never had a lecture on it in the psychology classes we had to attend, the psychiatry classes we had to attend.
Wow.
It was never, it was a word that I'd never heard until I was 42 years old and experienced the sensation of safety for the first time. So
that is a very powerful story you shared with that young kid.
yeah, a very painful experience to go through, and it set off a very unfortunate chain of events. Very, that could easily have led to death and destruction, but it didn't. And people often ask me, if I'm grateful that I walked that path. And to a degree, I would say I am, because had I not walked that path, I wouldn't be the therapist I am today. That is part of who I am. I don't see what I do as my job.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get up every morning and go to my work. I don't. In other words, this isn't my job. This is who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And whether I was being paid for it or not, I would be compelled to do it.
So let's talk about what you are doing currently. What is it that
Yeah.
you are? I mean, obviously you're on a mission. What are you doing?
So what I'm doing is, for the last 10 years or so, I've been working in institutions, both private and public sector, and building up my reputation as a trauma therapist. And when that reputation reached a certain height, I was able to go into private practice. So I went into private practice, built up quite a successful private practice. And of course, the pandemic years were very lucrative for us because people were really suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And we also learned a great deal about, humans through that pandemic process. What happens to people who have no history of any kind of psychological illness, and you apply an extreme stressor on them, which is essentially what trauma is. It is a disorder of extreme stress. When you apply an extreme stressor on them, what's the result? Well, the truth is, we don't know. We've only just come out the other end, and there are questions as to whether we've actually come out the other end. So right. There are more questions than there are answers. So what I've set myself to doing is, rather than working with individuals one at a time, which allows me to take them through the 4 stages of treatment and go in depth, and do a thorough exploration of their suffering and be able to help them to heal from their trauma. What I'm doing is I'm going in the other direction. I'm going horizontally, which is to share the information, not at that depth, but with as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. Hence the writing of the book. This is the first year in 10 years where I've done the least clinical work. Normally my clinical list is completely full with a waiting list behind it. But this year I've deliberately taken on much less clinical work so that I could devote it to writing this book, getting it published, getting it right, and writing it in such a way that is accessible to the man in the street. And as I say on the back cover of the book,
What's the name of the book, Reshie?
The name of the title of the book is A Beginner's Guide to Trauma.
Okay.
Yeah. So it gives you the basics. It talks about the brain science, who gets trauma, why do they get it, what causes it, what happens in the brain when they get it, why do they react the way they do, what can be done about it, right? That's the first part of it. I've also been extraordinarily fortunate to have a young lady who has allowed me to publish 4 of her therapy diary pages, unexpurgated and unedited, in the middle of the book. This is the closest you will get to a fly on the wall of someone going through the reprocessing of trauma and what is going through their mind. And she's kindly allowed me to publish this book. Sorry, these 4 pages. As we were reprocessing her trauma, she was at that stage. So that divides the book from the first part, which is about answering the basic questions about trauma, what it is, how you have it, etc. And then the second half of the book, I expand the topic into the controversial areas. So for example, is Big Pharma the cause of the opioid crisis? I ask that question. And I take a position that I know I'm going to have to defend, because my answer to that is no, they're not the cause of it. I expand the discussion to include the importance of the somatic therapies and their development because of the way trauma affects the nervous system. It affects one very specific aspect of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, and you can't get to that entirely through talking. There has to be movement, and there has to be some form of somaticization in the therapy if you are to get to it. I'll give you an example. I was working with a young lady who'd been a victim of rape, and like me, she was very bright and completely dissociated from the emotional horror of what had happened to her. When she was telling me the details of the rape, it was like listening to a newscaster just reading, off a script. As I was just filled with horror, she had no emotions to it. So I got one of my somatic therapists, in my team. I brought one of them in and I said, look, can you do some work with her and see if you can gently, open her up gently, so that I have something to work with. And they started, not much happened. And then there was one session where the somatic therapist, who's very often also a yoga therapist or a yoga teacher, put her in a position where her face was on one side and her legs were in a certain position. And that was the position that the man had her in when he raped her. He slammed her face on the floor in that position and bent her legs in that way. And as soon as her body adopted the position, the floodgates opened, and I had a very frantic call from a somatic therapist saying, you need to get your ass over here right now because I've done my bit, and we've got an absolutely hysterical young lady, so you need to do your bit, you know. So I rushed over to the other side of, so I rushed over and did my bit. But yeah, so I expand the discussion to include subjects like that. There are other subjects that are even more controversial. I know that Gabor Mate takes the position that all ADHD is rooted in trauma. I've read the evidence on it. I've read 29 scientific papers on it, and I would say that the evidence is inconclusive. What I try and do, Guy, in this book is where I think I know, I say so. And where I don't know, I say so. And when I'm not clear, when the evidence is not fully clear, I say so as well. And the final chapter of the book is a discussion of trauma in society, a sort of beginner's version of Gabor Mate's latest book, The Myth of Normal, you know, shrunk into 40 pages instead of 600. And I talk about how trauma, you know, is it possible for societies as a whole to get traumatized, right? We know that individuals can get traumatized, but can entire societies get traumatized? And if that is the case, how does it happen? How do we know it's happened? What tells us it's happened? And on this, I relied very heavily on some of the great American scholars of the early 20th century, like W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin and Emil Durkheim and Fritz Stern, many others, to understand what happens when, you know, people suffer that same alienation, disconnection, and despair that I suffered as a child, but do so on a collective basis. You know, what are the pathologies that come out as a result of that? And that's the final chapter of the book. The epilogue is a story of my cat. It's an interesting story. We were given this kitten. The kitten was severely traumatized, never meowed. You never found her. She only ever stayed in one drawer in one room and never moved. And I thought, well, here is a chance to actually test what all the textbooks are telling me, right? They're all telling me this is not frontal lobe stuff. This is, you know, mammalian brain stuff, limbic brain stuff, reptilian brain stuff. Well, the cat's got that, so in theory it should work. So I tested the theory on the cat, and lo and behold, 10 days after applying the system to the cat suddenly became a different animal. It meowed for the first time. It became affectionate. It healed from its trauma. And that was when I knew that the theory was accurate and that what we were doing was correct.
Reshie, where can people get the book?
Well, the book is not yet launched.
Okay.
It is, what's the launch date? I believe the launch date, we're trying to hit the Christmas crowd. The marketing people can't decide between the 17th and the 19th. So I'm going to say the 19th or the 17th.
Is it going to be up like on Amazon?
It's going to be on Amazon. Yeah.
Okay.
You're going to be able to get it in the Kindle form. You're going to be able to get it in the print form.
Okay.
And you're also going to get it in the audiobook form, which is myself reciting it.
Oh, great.
And I just like to say that I read solidly for 13 hours and lost my voice as a result of that. You know, such is my commitment to the cause.
So we're talking about a beginner's guide to trauma, understanding the toxic effects of the disorders of extreme stress. We'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. We'll have your website up as well. And what is, as we kind of close out here, Reshie, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
The best way they can get in contact is via my website. If they go to my website, which is livingfree.today,
okay,
very easy to remember. There's a number there that takes them straight to my personal assistant, who will get back to them within 24 hours. There is an email address that they can email if they would prefer to do that. So if they wish to get hold of me, and I work with clients from all over the world, so, you know, I'm given that we now have this telemedicine and, you know, Zoom platforms. I'm not inhibited with countries and borders. You know, we now live in a borderless world, essentially. You know, a doctor can perform an operation in India from America. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So
that's livingfree.today.
Not today, yeah.
Livingfree.today. Reshie, I want to thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your story. Very inspiring. I appreciate you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And I was just wondering if I might ask a question of you.
Yes.
Would I be able to get a recording of this podcast? Would that be possible?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I would like that very much, just to have it. All the podcasts I've done, I have in a data bank.
Of course.
And this one is a particularly important one, given, you know, the individuals you've interviewed in the past, and you know, I won't elaborate too much, but it's one that I would really like to have for posterity, and to be able to, you know, use if I felt I needed to.
Definitely. As soon as I get it edited, we'll get you a copy.
Thank you very much, Guy.
All right, sir. Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Guy. You know, I don't know if I've answered all your questions succinctly. I don't know if I've given you the information in a clear and succinct way. I hope I have, anyway.
You certainly did. You did more.
Well, thank you.
I appreciate it. We'll be in touch.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you, Guy. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
You are very welcome. Take care, sir.
Yeah, and you.